When a pharmaceutical company loses its quality control documentation, people don't just lose money, they lose lives. I understood that better than anyone. I had spent 23 years making sure it never happened. I was sitting in my truck in the parking lot of a Tim Hortons on Wellington Street in Ottawa, drinking a double-double and watching the February sleet come down sideways off the Ottawa River. It was 6:45 in the morning. I'd been parking in that same spot, in that same lot, before the same early shift, for longer than some of my colleagues had been alive. That morning felt different though. My phone had 3 missed calls from a number I didn't recognize, all from the night before, and a voicemail I hadn't opened yet. I finished my coffee first. My name is Gordon, and for 23 years I was the Director of Regulatory Compliance at Carleton BioPharmaceuticals, a mid-sized drug manufacturer based in Ottawa's West End, just off the Queensway near Nepean. We made generic medications, blood pressure drugs, cholesterol medications, a line of antibiotic generics that went to hospitals across Ontario and into procurement contracts with the federal government. Nothing glamorous, but the kind of work where, if you got it wrong, someone in a hospital bed somewhere didn't get the medication their doctor ordered, or worse, got medication that hadn't been properly validated. I knew every filing in that building, every Health Canada submission, every good manufacturing practice audit report, every deviation log, every batch record going back further than our current computer system could hold. The paper files were mine. I knew where they were, why they existed, and what they meant. That kind of institutional knowledge doesn't get built in a year or two. It gets built over decades of showing up and paying attention. My wife used to joke that I had a closer relationship with our filing cabinets than I did with her. She wasn't entirely wrong. She said it with a smile, though. She understood what the work meant. The man who ended my career at Carleton was my boss's nephew. I'll call him by his first name, which was Elliot, because that's what he insisted everyone call him from his first day. Just Elliot, no mister. We're all colleagues here. Which should have been the first warning sign. He was 29 years old when he was brought in as Chief Operating Officer. He had an MBA from Queen's and 2 years of consulting experience at a firm in Toronto that had, as far as I could tell, never touched the pharmaceutical manufacturing sector in any meaningful way. His uncle was Victor, our CEO, who had built Carleton from a small generics operation in the 90s into a company with 400 employees and a solid Health Canada track record. Victor was a decent man. What he did with his nephew was not his finest hour. Elliot arrived in September. By November, he had commissioned a strategic efficiency review. By January, he had the results, which he presented to the senior leadership team with a PowerPoint deck that had a lot of gradient backgrounds and not very much regulatory context. I sat in that boardroom and watched him go through the slides. He'd identified what he called legacy overhead, positions and departments that he felt were overbuilt for the company's current size. Quality and compliance came up on slide 14. My department specifically. We were 4 people, myself, 2 compliance analysts named Fiona and Jerome, and an administrative coordinator who had been with the company almost as long as I had. The director-level position here is a significant salary line, Elliot said, not looking at me. And frankly, with our current Health Canada submission volumes, it's a role we can absorb at the manager level. We're not a big pharma company. We don't need a big pharma compliance infrastructure. I looked at Victor. Victor looked at his notepad. I had 3 decades of industry experience, a professional certification from the Canadian Society for Pharmaceutical Sciences, and a track record of 0 Health Canada enforcement actions in 23 years. Elliot had 2 years of consulting and the CEO's blood in his veins. You can probably guess how that meeting ended. They gave me 60 days notice, which was the legal requirement, plus a few weeks that I suspected were meant to make Victor feel better about the whole thing. They were generous with the severance. I won't pretend otherwise, but generous severance doesn't change what it is. I cleaned up my office over a weekend in late February. Fiona cried. Jerome shook my hand and held it for a long time without saying anything. My administrative coordinator, A woman named Phyllis, who had worked alongside me since before my kids were in high school, hugged me in the parking lot and said, "This is wrong, Gordon. This is just wrong." And I told her I knew and that she'd be okay, and that she should call me if she ever needed a reference. I drove home on the 417. I stopped at the Tim Hortons on Wellington. I sat in the parking lot for a long time. My wife was waiting at the kitchen table when I walked in. She'd made tea. She didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at me, and then she said, "Okay, what do you need?" That's the thing about a good marriage. 26 years in, and that woman still knows exactly what to say. What I needed, it turned out, was to be methodical. I spent the next few weeks doing what I had always done, documenting everything. I went through my personal files, not company files, my own professional records, and I organized everything I had worked on over the years, my certifications, my correspondence with Health Canada, my professional development records, consulting contacts, industry colleagues who had reached out over the years about positions. I wasn't bitter. That's what I want to be clear about. I was 54 years old and I had plenty of runway left in my career. I had a reputation that had taken 2 decades to build, and nobody could take that away. I reached out to a few former colleagues, updated my LinkedIn profile for the first time in years, and started having coffee conversations with people in the industry. It was my daughter who told me to be patient. She was doing her residency in Toronto at the time, working brutal hospital hours, and she called me every Sunday evening. One night she said, "Dad, you spent 23 years being right about things nobody paid attention to. Don't be in a rush to prove it." I told her she sounded like her mother. She said that was the best thing I'd ever said to her. Meanwhile, back at Carleton, things were moving quickly. Elliot had not replaced me. Not really. He had promoted one of the compliance analysts, not Fiona, who had the experience, but a younger analyst who had been with the company for about 18 months and who, I later learned, was more receptive to Elliot's management style, which is a polite way of saying he didn't push back. They gave this analyst the manager title and about 60% of my old responsibilities, with the understanding that an outside consultant would be brought in as needed for the bigger regulatory filings. I knew what that meant. I had written the documentation protocols. I knew exactly what as needed would become when a major filing came due. What Elliot did not know, what I suspect he never bothered to find out, was that Carleton had been in preliminary discussions for over a year with a German pharmaceutical group called Weiss Hartmann AG. Weiss Hartmann was a significant European player looking to expand their North American generics manufacturing footprint through acquisition. Carleton was an attractive target, established Health Canada relationships, a clean compliance record, solid procurement contracts with the federal government and several provincial health ministries. The deal had been discussed at the board level. The valuation being floated was in the range of $340 million. $340 million. For a 400-person generics operation in Ottawa's West End. That number had been built, in no small part, on the compliance record that my department had maintained for over 2 decades. The clean audit history. The zero enforcement actions. The documentation that demonstrated we ran a tight, well-organized, professionally managed regulatory operation. I found out about the Weiss Hartmann deal through a former colleague who had moved into M&A advisory work. He called me about 6 weeks after I left Carleton not to tell me anything confidential, but just to mention, as one professional to another, that he'd heard Carleton was in active discussions with a European buyer, and that whoever they've got handling compliance over there right now is going to have a very busy spring. I thanked him and went back to my tea. Weiss Hartmann conducted their due diligence the way German companies conduct due diligence, thoroughly, systematically, and with an almost religious attention to documentation. Their regulatory lead was a woman named Dr. Narsem, Ingrid Baumann, who had spent 15 years with the European Medicines Agency before moving into private sector M&A. She had reviewed pharmaceutical acquisitions across 4 continents. She was not a person who accepted "we'll follow up on that" as an answer. The due diligence process ran for about 10 weeks. I wasn't there, obviously, but I heard about it afterward from multiple sources, and the picture that emerged was consistent. Dr. Baumann's team had requested the full regulatory documentation package in week 2. What they received was complete for recent filings, the past 2 or 3 years, but had significant gaps in the historical record. Audit response documentation from a 2019 Health Canada inspection was missing its supporting annexes. The batch record archive for a product line that had been reformulated in 2020 had a chain of custody gap that nobody could explain. And a series of submissions from 2017 and 2018 that had been cross-referenced in more recent filings simply could not be located in the system. Those documents existed. I knew they existed because I had filed them. They were in the physical archive in room 114 of the Carleton facility, in the grey filing cabinets along the north wall, organised by submission date and Health Canada file number. They had always been there, but in my absence nobody had known to look there. The new compliance manager had digitised everything he could find, assumed the rest had been superseded, and told Elliot that the documentation package was complete. It was not complete. Dr. Baumann's team flagged the gaps in week 6 of due diligence. Elliot's team scrambled. They found some of what was missing. They couldn't find the rest. The submission history from 2017-2018 remained unlocated. The audit annexes were not in the digital system. The chain of custody documentation for the 2020 reformulation had been filed under a cross-reference code that nobody currently at the company knew how to interpret, because that code structure was something I had developed, and I had explained it to Fiona. But Fiona was not the one who had been given the manager role. 3 weeks before the scheduled closing, Dr. Baumann requested a meeting with Carleton's leadership. I wasn't there, but someone who was there later described it to me this way. She arrived with 2 colleagues and a folder roughly 3 inches thick. She sat down across from Victor and Elliot and their legal team. She opened the folder. She placed a series of tabbed documents on the table. And she said, in the measured, precise English that she had learned as a second language and deployed with a native speaker's confidence, "Before we proceed, I need to understand the disposition of these regulatory records. The gaps I am seeing in your documentation package represent either a compliance failure or a records management failure. In either case, they are material to our valuation. Elliot's case, they are sure it was a records management issue and that his team would resolve it promptly. Dr. Mendemerant's wish and solve it promptly." Baumann looked at him for a moment. Then she asked, "Who is Gordon Ashworth?" Elliot didn't know how to answer that. Victor knew. Victor had known for the past 8 months what Elliot had done, and I think somewhere in the back of his mind he had known what it might eventually cost. He said, "Gordon was our Director of Regulatory Compliance. He retired earlier this year." "Retired?" said Dr. Baumann. She looked at the folder. His name appears on 47 regulatory submissions between 2015 and 2020. His certification number is on the audit response documentation from your 2019 inspection. The cross-reference system in your physical archive appears to have been designed by him based on the notation conventions, and yet the person currently managing your compliance function was unable to locate 3 years of submissions that are apparently essential to understanding your current regulatory standing. The room was quiet. "I don't retire compliance directors," she said. "Not in the middle of an active acquisition process, particularly not the ones who built the documentation architecture I am trying to navigate." She closed the folder. "I would like to speak with Mr. Ashworth directly if he is available. Otherwise, I need 2 weeks to re-examine the scope of our offer." That's when Elliot understood what he had done. The call I mentioned, the one I had sitting on my phone that February morning in the Tim Hortons parking lot, was from Victor. He had called 3 times the previous evening. When I finally listened to the voicemail, he said he needed to speak with me urgently about a matter related to Carleton's regulatory documentation, and that he hoped I might be willing to have a conversation. I waited 2 days before I called him back. My wife thought I should wait 3. We compromised. When I called, Victor answered on the first ring. He didn't waste time. He told me about the Weiss-Hartmann deal. He told me about Dr. Baumann. He told me about the documentation gaps in the archive and the cross-reference system that nobody could interpret. He told me that Dr. Baumann had specifically asked for me by name. And then he was quiet for a moment, and he said, "I owe you an apology, Gordon. What happened in February was wrong. I should have stopped it." I let that sit for a few seconds. Then I said, "What are you asking me, Victor?" He asked if I would be willing to come back in a consulting capacity. Short term. To help locate and organize the missing documentation, walk Dr. Baumann's team through the archive, and certify the completeness of the regulatory package. He said Carleton would pay my consulting rate, which we both understood would be substantially higher than what my salary had been. He said it was my choice, no pressure, and he understood if the answer was no. I told him I needed to think about it. I talked it over with my wife that night. She listened to the whole thing, and then she said, "Do you want to do it?" I thought about Phyllis, who was still there. I thought about Fiona and Jerome, who were still there, who had done nothing wrong. I thought about 400 people whose livelihoods were tied up in whether this acquisition went through cleanly. I thought about the procurement contracts with the provincial health ministries, and the hospitals that were counting on those antibiotic generics, and the patients who didn't care about corporate politics, but very much cared about getting the right medication at the right dose. I said yes, not for Elliot, not for Victor, really, for the work itself. I walked back into Carleton on a Tuesday morning in mid-March. I used my old access card, which they had kept active, I suspected on Dr. Baumann's insistence. I went directly to room 114. I unlocked the grey filing cabinets. Everything was exactly where I had left it. The 2017 submissions were in the third drawer, behind the divider tab marked Q42 Session Seat 2017 FWD, which is where they had always been, which was logical if you understood that I organized by Health Canada fiscal year rather than calendar year, and which was completely opaque if you didn't. I spent 4 days going through the archive with a member of Dr. Baumann's team, a young German woman named Petra, who had a background in regulatory science and who asked excellent questions and wrote very thorough notes. We located every missing document. I walked her through the cross-reference system. I explained the notation conventions and wrote up a guide so that whoever managed compliance going forward would be able to navigate the archive without having to rebuild the logic from scratch. On the 4th day, Petra put down her pen and said, "You built this system yourself?" I said I had, over a number of years. She said, "It's very logical. It's also completely undocumented." I said that was fair. I told her that when you build something yourself, you sometimes forget to write down the obvious parts. She said that was a problem she saw often in family-owned companies and founder-led operations. The institutional knowledge lives in one person, and nobody thinks to extract it until that person is gone. I told her she was not wrong about that. On the 5th day, Dr. Baumann came to the archive herself. She shook my hand and thanked me for coming back. She said the documentation package was now complete and that she was satisfied with the compliance record. She said that in her experience, the quality of regulatory documentation was the single most reliable predictor of an organization's actual operational discipline. And she said, the record here is very good. It reflects someone who cared about doing it correctly. I thanked her. I meant it. The Weiss-Hartmann acquisition closed 8 weeks later. The final valuation came in at $312 million, slightly below the initial figure because Dr. Baumann's team had negotiated a modest reduction tied to the documentation gaps and the need for compliance function restructuring going forward. That restructuring, per the terms of the deal, included a commitment to hire a qualified director-level compliance officer within 90 days of closing. Elliot was not part of the post-acquisition leadership team. The transition plan, as I understood it from Victor in a phone call shortly after closing, had been politely but clearly communicated by Weiss-Hartmann's integration team. The new structure would not include his role. He had moved on to other things. I didn't follow up on what those things were. Victor retired at the end of that year. He sent me a Christmas card with a handwritten note that said he was proud of what Carleton had been, and sorry for the detour at the end. It was a decent note. I put it on the fridge for a few weeks and then filed it away. I did not go back to Carleton full-time. Weiss Hartmann asked if I would consider a permanent position with the new compliance structure, and I gave it serious thought. But I was 54 years old, I had good consulting relationships, and I liked the flexibility. I took on 3 clients that year. A pharmaceutical startup in the Waterloo region, a biologics company in Vancouver that needed help with a Health Canada Type 2 variation submission, and a generics firm in Mississauga that was preparing for their first federal procurement bid. The work was good, the rates were better than they had ever been. My daughter finished her residency and called me one Sunday evening to tell me she'd accepted a position at a hospital in Ottawa. She'd be 20 minutes from our house. My wife started planning the dinners immediately. Some mornings I still drive to the Tim Hortons on Wellington Street. Same parking spot, same double-double, same view of the Ottawa River. The sleet still comes down sideways in February. The city still moves at its own pace, practical and unhurried, the way it always has. I think about something Petra said on our last day in the archive when she was packing up her notes. She said, "In Germany, we have an expression. The engineer who designed the bridge is worth more than the contractor who built it, because the contractor can be replaced, but the design cannot." She paused. "I think you are that engineer." I told her I appreciated that. I told her I'd just been trying to do the job right. She said that was the same thing. I believe she was correct. The person who understands why the system was built the way it was, not just how it works today, but the reasoning behind every decision, the problems it was designed to prevent, the logic underneath the logic. That person is not overhead. That person is load-bearing. You can remove a load-bearing wall if you want to. People do it all the time. But you'd better have a very good plan for what you're putting in its place. Elliot did not have a plan. I did. I just didn't tell anyone it was a plan. I showed up every day for 23 years and did the work carefully. The plan took care of itself. I still think about that grey filing cabinet in room 114, third drawer, behind the Q4 2016-2017 FWDT tab. Everything exactly where I left it. Not because I had planned it that way, I hadn't planned anything. I had just spent 23 years putting things where they belonged and writing down why. That's the part people miss when they look at a story like mine and call it karma. They want it to be a trap I set. It wasn't. It was just the natural weight of things coming to rest. What I've come to understand, sitting in that Tim Hortons parking lot enough mornings to lose count, is that the way you do your work is a kind of character. Not the visible kind, not the kind that gets you applause in a meeting or a mention in a company newsletter. The deeper kind. The kind that shows up in whether your filing system still makes sense to a German regulatory scientist 5 years after you built it. Elliot thought he was cutting overhead. What he was actually doing was severing the ethical backbone of an operation that had been built on the premise that doing it right mattered more than doing it fast. You can't replace that with a younger title and a smaller salary line. The discipline of caring. Genuinely caring whether the documentation is complete, whether the cross-reference is accurate, whether the person coming after you will be able to find what they need. That discipline is either there or it isn't. It doesn't live in a job description. And then there's the matter of understanding things deeply enough to be useful when it counts. Petra asked me, on that last day in the archive, whether I had ever written down how the system worked. I told her I hadn't, not fully. She said that was a problem she saw often. I've thought about that conversation a lot since. The knowledge I'd built wasn't just experience, it was the accumulated result of asking why every time I didn't understand something, of following a compliance thread all the way back to its origin instead of accepting the summary. That kind of understanding doesn't come from being smart. It comes from being relentlessly curious and a little stubborn. My daughter has it. It's why she's a good doctor. You don't just treat the symptom. You want to know what's underneath. The stubbornness part is the one I'm least comfortable talking about, because it sounds like pride. But there's a version of it that isn't pride at all. It's just the refusal to quit on something that matters. Every audit season, every Health Canada inspection, every year that another COO or VP came through and suggested we could streamline compliance, I went back to my desk and kept doing it the same careful way, not to prove a point, because the point had already been proven 23 years ago when I first understood what could go wrong if someone got the wrong medication at the wrong dose. Victor apologized. I accepted it and meant it. Elliot moved on. I don't carry anything about him. What I carry is simpler. The memory of Phyllis hugging me in a parking lot and saying, "This is wrong, Gordon," and me telling her she'd be okay, and knowing even then, standing in the February cold with a box of desk things in my arms, that I had done the work correctly, that nobody could take that back, that the record spoke for itself, and eventually it would. It did.